In the heart of Alaska, where the cold winds bite and the snow never seems to end, a secret was about to be exposed, one so dark that it would shatter a family forever. Fatima thought she had escaped her past, but the twisted web of lies, betrayal, and forbidden love she had woven would soon pull her into a deadly game of survival. What began as a quiet, isolated life in the Alaskan wilderness would soon explode into a true crime tale, where the line between love and violence was not only crossed, but obliterated. It was the winter of 2015. One of those harsh Alaskan winters where the snow never seemed to stop, and the temperatures rarely crept above freezing. The cold had a way of settling into your bones, making the quiet of the wilderness seem even more intense. Anchorage, a city that prided itself on being both the gateway to the wilds and a modern center of business, was a place where secrets were buried just as deep as the snowdrifts. But even in the frozen isolation of the Alaskan landscape, darkness could find its way in. Fatima Wilkins was the kind of woman who seemed to have it all. She was married to Hassan, a successful businessman who owned one of the largest construction firms in the area. They lived in a large, comfortable home that overlooked the icy waters of Cook Inlet, with panoramic views of the mountains. Their life appeared perfect on the outside, a loving couple with 2 children, a dog, and the occasional summer BBQ with neighbors. But like many things in Alaska, the perfect exterior of Fatima's life hid something far colder and darker beneath. The marriage between Hassan and Fatima, while outwardly loving, was far from perfect. Hassan was a man consumed by his work, often away on business trips for weeks at a time. This left Fatima, beautiful and lonely, in the vast emptiness of their home. It wasn't long before she found herself drifting, searching for something to fill the void in her life. Fatima had always been close to Hassan's father, Aftab Wilkins, a rugged man with a history of his own. Aftab, in his late 60s, was a man who had never been much for sentimentality or affection, but he was a man who understood the depths of loneliness. After Hassan's mother had passed away years earlier, Aftab had retreated into his own world, often seeking solace in alcohol and solitude. But when Hassan was away, Aftab would often visit, and he became a familiar presence in Fatima's life. At first, the visits were innocent. Aftab would come over to watch the news or help around the house. Fatima enjoyed the conversations with him. They were the only times she felt truly heard. Aftab, in return, appreciated her company, often remarking how much she reminded him of his late wife. But, as the winter of 2015 deepened, so too did their connection. Fatima's loneliness, combined with Aftab's quiet understanding of her pain, made them both vulnerable. They began to spend more time together, cooking meals, sharing stories, and talking late into the night. It was during these long conversations that their relationship began to shift. Slowly, insidiously, Aftab began to confide in Fatima about his own regrets and failures in life. He told her about his past mistakes, his years of infidelity, and the long, bitter divorce from Hassan's mother. Fatima, always an empathetic listener, began to feel a deep sense of admiration and, oddly enough, attraction to the older man. Aftab had a rugged charm, a sense of security that she hadn't realized she craved. He wasn't rich like Hassan, nor was he a man of refined elegance. But there was a rawness to him, an authenticity that seemed to pull Fatima in. In a moment of weakness, Fatima found herself drawn into his charm. What began as a shared moment of connection quickly turned into something far more dangerous, an affair. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and Fatima found herself caught in a web of emotions that she had never anticipated. The affair was conducted in secret, as one might expect. Hassan remained oblivious to the growing connection between his father and his wife. For Aftab, the affair was a way to feel desired again, a way to assert some control over his life after years of feeling forgotten. For Fatma, it was a desperate attempt to reclaim something she felt she had lost. Their relationship grew more intense as the winter wore on. Their meetings were often hidden behind closed doors, in the privacy of Fatma's home, when Hassan was out on business or in meetings. Sometimes Aftab would stay overnight, pretending to sleep on the couch, but the nights were filled with passion and regret. They knew it was wrong, knew the dangers of what they were doing, but the temptation, the thrill of their forbidden love, was too great to resist. It was clear that Fatima wasn't the only one losing control. Aftab's behavior began to change. His visits became more frequent, his presence more intrusive. The once quiet and reserved man was now consumed by an overwhelming desire to keep Fatima close. He began to make demands of her, subtly at first, insisting she wear certain clothes when he came over, asking for more time together. Aftab wanted more, and he wasn't shy about showing it. Fatima, now trapped in the affair, couldn't bring herself to break free. She was torn between the comfort of Aftab's embrace and the knowledge that she was betraying her husband and family. She began to rationalize the situation, telling herself that Hassan was too busy to care about her, that Aftab was the only one who truly understood her. But things were about to take a darker turn. As the weeks passed, Fatima's guilt began to eat away at her. She couldn't keep the secret forever. There were moments when she almost confessed to Hassan, when the weight of the lies seemed unbearable. But each time she came close, she pulled back, convincing herself that everything would be fine, that no one would ever know the truth. The tragic reality of Fatima's situation, however, was that the truth was already beginning to surface. The tension between her, Aftab, and Hassan had grown palpable, though Hassan remained blissfully unaware of the affair. But Aftab, ever the unpredictable and unstable man, had begun to lose his grip on reality. The pressure of keeping the secret was starting to get to him. He became possessive, demanding, and even aggressive at times. One fateful evening, when Hassan was away on a business trip, Aftab showed up at Fatima's house earlier than expected. Fatima, exhausted from the constant guilt and fear of being discovered, found herself caught in an impossible situation. What began as a casual visit turned into something far more dangerous. You've made it this far. Don't miss the rest. Subscribe now so you can continue following these incredible true crime investigations as they unfold. Aftab's demeanor had shifted. He was no longer the man she had known. The man who had once sought solace in her company was now demanding her undivided attention, questioning her loyalty. The conversation quickly escalated, and Fatima found herself locked in a struggle to break free. It was during this moment of vulnerability that the shocking truth would soon unravel, and the consequences of their actions would prove far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. As Aftab's jealousy and possessiveness grew, so too did the danger lurking within the walls of Fatima's home. What had once seemed like a simple affair was now spiraling into something far darker. And the darkness of that fateful evening in 2015 still haunts me, even now, as I recount the tragic events that unfolded in the small, isolated home nestled on the outskirts of Anchorage. It was the kind of evening where the biting wind howled against the walls, and the snow piled up higher with each passing hour. The isolation of the house, perched on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, only seemed to amplify the intensity of what was happening within. Aftab had always been a man of extremes. Either he was calm and collected, or consumed by a smoldering rage. But that night, as Fatma and Aftab stood in the kitchen, the weight of their secrets finally began to take its toll on both of them. Fatma, her face pale with the exhaustion of carrying the guilt for so long, tried desperately to keep the situation from escalating further. She had no idea how it had gotten this far, how their forbidden relationship had evolved from the occasional embrace into something all-consuming. And now, with Hassan miles away on a business trip, she was facing the terrifying reality that her choices could cost her everything. As Aftab stepped closer to Fatima, his eyes narrowed with a possessiveness that sent a chill down her spine. Fatima could feel the atmosphere shifting. The air was thick with tension, suffocating in its intensity. She could see the anger building behind his steely gaze, the jealousy that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks now boiling over. Aftab had always been unpredictable, but tonight he was different, more volatile, more unhinged. She tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The kitchen door was blocked, and the large, dimly lit room suddenly felt too small for the two of them. Fatima, what's going on? Aftab's voice was low, almost menacing. You can't keep pushing me away like this. I know what you're doing. Her heart raced as she tried to steady her breath. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her, and for a brief moment she considered confessing everything to him. But she knew that confessing wouldn't save her. It would only drag her deeper into this nightmare. She had no idea what Aftab was capable of, what he might do if pushed too far. The truth, as she now understood, was more dangerous than any lie. "I'm not pushing you away, Aftab," Fatima whispered, her voice trembling. "I just need some space. I'm confused. This isn't right. We've gone too far." But Aftab wasn't listening. His face was now inches from hers, his breath heavy with the scent of whiskey. Fatima could see the madness in his eyes, the desperation that had taken hold of him. He was no longer the man who had once offered her solace. This was a stranger, a man consumed by his own obsessions, someone who couldn't control the darkness inside him. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Aftab spat, his voice rising. "You think I don't know what's been happening between you and me, between you and my son? You can't hide it from me anymore. I know everything." Fatima's stomach churned. She had been careful, so careful to keep her secret hidden. She thought she had covered her tracks and kept their affair hidden from Hassan. But the walls of their home, so thick and seemingly impenetrable, now seemed to close in around her, and she realized, too late, that she had underestimated Aftab's awareness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never wanted this to happen. It's a mistake. It was all a mistake." Aftab's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, Fatima feared he might strike her. But instead he grabbed her by the wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. "A mistake? You think this was just a mistake?" he growled. "You've been playing me for a fool, haven't you? You think you can have it all, my son's wealth, my company, and me." Fatima struggled to pull away, but Aftab's grip only tightened. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, the force of his anger threatening to crush her. The man who had once been a comforting presence in her life was now her captor, and for the first time, Fatima realized just how far gone Aftab had become. "Aftab, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Let go. You're hurting me." But Aftab was beyond hearing her pleas. He was lost in the chaos of his own emotions, consumed by a rage that had been building for months. His jealousy had turned to madness, and Fatima was now the focal point of his obsession. She had never seen him like this before, never imagined he could be capable of such violence. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Fatima could feel the walls closing in on her. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape before it was too late. But as she tried to break free from Aftab's grasp, the door to the kitchen suddenly swung open, and Hassan stood in the doorway, his face filled with shock and confusion. "Dad?" Hassan's voice was barely a whisper, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The sight of his wife and his father, locked in such an intimate struggle, was enough to send a shockwave through him, paralyzing him in place. Fatima's heart stopped. She could feel the air around her freeze, and for a moment, everything went silent. The truth had come crashing down in the most brutal and devastating way possible. There was no hiding, no escaping. Hassan's eyes darted between Fatima and Aftab, his face a mixture of disbelief, pain, and betrayal. "Hassan," Fatima said softly, but the words felt hollow. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she justify the destruction she had caused? But Hassan wasn't listening. His expression shifted from shock to fury in an instant. "You!" He could barely get the words out, his voice trembling with rage. "How could you? How could you do this to me, to our family?" Fatima could see the pain in his eyes, the confusion and the heartbreak. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, and now there was no turning back. Aftab, too, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. His hand slowly released its grip on Fatima's wrist, and for the first time that evening he seemed to deflate, the anger leaving his body like air from a punctured balloon. Hassan's gaze flicked to his father, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You, of all people, how could you do this to me?" he whispered, his voice broken. It was then that Fatima realized just how deep the wound went. Hassan was not only hurt by her betrayal, but by his father's as well. And in that moment, the fragile thread of their family, already frayed by lies and deceit, snapped. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo the hurt they had caused. But the story was far from over. What began as a painful confrontation between a wife, her husband, and his father would soon take a far darker turn. The truth, once out in the open, would unravel in ways none of them could predict. As Hassan stormed out of the room, Aftab and Fatima stood there in the aftermath of their actions, knowing that the consequences of their choices would soon be irreversible. As Hassan stormed out of the house, the silence that followed was suffocating. Fatima stood frozen, her mind spinning with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. There was no turning back now. The facade she had carefully crafted for so long had shattered in an instant, and the consequences of her actions were unfolding before her, too fast to stop. It wasn't just the affair, not just the betrayal of her husband. It was the cruel, painful reality that she had lost her family. The trust she had spent years building with Hassan was now irreparably broken. And even though her heart pounded with regret, she knew that what had been done could never be undone. The snowstorm outside seemed to intensify as the night wore on, the winds howling against the windows as if they were in sync with the chaos inside the house. Fatima felt like a stranger in her own skin. The room that had once been a place of comfort and warmth now felt cold and distant. She barely registered Aftab's presence beside her as he stood motionless, his face a mixture of anger and confusion, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. For years, Aftab had been a man driven by his impulses, his desires, his need for control. And now, standing next to Fatima, there was no sense of remorse or acknowledgement of what they had done. He was a man consumed by his own demons, lost in the mess they had both created. But what was most chilling was that he didn't seem to care about the consequences. The moments that followed seemed like an eternity. Fatima didn't know what to do or where to go. She wanted to leave, to run away from the suffocating weight of her guilt, but she knew that running wouldn't change anything. Hassan had seen everything. The truth was out in the open. The betrayal was too much for him to bear, and now Fatima was left to face the wreckage of their once happy family. When Aftab finally moved, it was as if he had snapped out of his stupor. His movements were erratic, his eyes darting around the room, his face twisted in a way Fatima had never seen before. There was no apology, no remorse, only a coldness that sent a chill down her spine. It was clear to her now that Aftab had never cared for her the way she had thought. He had never cared about the consequences of their actions, only about satisfying his own desires. Fatima tried to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing she could say that would make things better. Hassan was gone, and in his absence there was nothing but a gaping hole of pain and betrayal. Aftab, too, was lost to her now. His obsession with her, his desire for control, had consumed him entirely. He had always been unpredictable, but now, in the wake of everything that had happened, he was something darker, more dangerous. It didn't take long for the storm to escalate. By the time Aftab had made his way to the living room, Fatima was already lost in her own thoughts, her mind reeling with the aftermath of the night's events. The wind outside had picked up, lashing against the windows as if trying to break in. The house felt like a prison, and Fatima was its unwilling inmate. She didn't know what Aftab was thinking, but she knew he wasn't finished. He couldn't be. A man like Aftab wasn't capable of letting go of something this big, this destructive. As the night wore on, Fatima's sense of dread deepened. She could hear Aftab pacing in the next room, muttering to himself in a low, angry tone. His words were incoherent, just a string of curses and half-sentences, but the anger in his voice was unmistakable. Fatima could hear the tension building, the sound of his boots pounding against the wooden floor, the sound of a man on the verge of snapping. She knew that this was far from over. She tried to move, to do something, but her legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. The snow outside had piled up high against the windows, the storm still raging in its fury. She glanced nervously toward the door, wondering if she could slip away, disappear into the wilderness. But she knew it was impossible. She had nowhere to go, and with the storm blocking the roads, there was no way for her to escape. Hours passed in agonizing silence, the only sounds the wind howling outside and the occasional thud of Aftab's footsteps. Fatima couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the dread that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It was like the calm before a storm, the tension building, winding tighter and tighter with every passing minute. Then, just as the clock struck 3 a.m., the silence was shattered. Aftab burst into the room, his face twisted with rage. His hands were shaking, his eyes wild with anger. Fatima didn't need to hear his words to know what was happening. It was all too clear now. Aftab had snapped. The man she had known, the man who had once held her in his arms, was gone. In his place was a monster, driven by his own jealousy, his own twisted sense of betrayal. Fatima tried to back away, but Aftab was too quick. He lunged at her, his hands grabbing hold of her shoulders and slamming her against the wall. The force of the impact left her breathless, and for a moment she could barely comprehend what was happening. She tried to push him away, but his strength was overwhelming. It was then that she realized the full extent of the danger she was in. Aftab wasn't just angry, he was out of control. Aftab's Zantreda was blinked. His voice was barely a whisper, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "You ruined everything, Fatima," he hissed. "You ruined everything." Pain in his voice sent a chill down Fatima's spine, and she realized, with horror, that Aftab had lost his mind. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, the grip so tight it was suffocating. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was acting on instinct, driven by the darkness that had overtaken him. There was no reasoning with him now. Fatima fought back, her heart racing, her mind scrambling for a way out, but Aftab was relentless. The room seemed to close in around her as he pushed her down to the floor, pinning her there with his body. She could feel his breath on her neck, could smell the whiskey on his breath. In that moment, as she struggled beneath him, she realized that there was no escaping this nightmare. The storm outside seemed to reflect the storm inside the house, as if the world itself was collapsing in on them. Aftab's hands tightened around her throat, and Fatima's vision began to blur. She fought for air, but it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape the terror that had consumed her. And as the darkness began to overtake her, she knew that this was the end. As Fatima's world began to fade, a coldness crept over her. The pressure around her throat, the weight of Aftab pressing down on her, was suffocating. Yet in those fleeting moments, time seemed to stretch, like she was suspended in the dark abyss of her own mind. For a brief, terrifying second, she thought she might not survive the night. The world outside was still engulfed by the violent snowstorm, a chaos that mirrored the turmoil within the walls of the house. But in the final, desperate surge of instinct, Fatma's body fought back. Her hands scrambled, her fingers finding perches on Aftab's wrists, pulling with every ounce of strength she had left. The sharp sting of cold, the thud of her own heartbeat pulsing in her ears, kept her focused on one thought: survival. Slowly, painfully, she managed to free her airway just enough to gasp for air. The grip loosened, and she coughed violently, clutching her throat in an attempt to regain control of her breath. Aftab, momentarily stunned by her resistance, hesitated for just long enough to give her a fighting chance. Fatima pulled herself up from the floor, blood pounding in her temples. Her chest burned, and her throat felt like it was on fire, but she refused to let it stop her. She scrambled away from Aftab, backing into a corner of the room, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. She couldn't stay there. She needed to get out. There was no telling what Aftab would do next, but one thing was certain. He had crossed a line that could never be erased. The dim light from the living room lamp cast eerie shadows across the room, heightening the sense of dread. Aftab stood there for a moment, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild. He looked almost unrecognizable. The man who had once been a father figure to her, who had shared meals and conversations with her in moments of warmth and comfort, was now a stranger. The cruel twist of fate that had led them here, to this violent moment, was too much for Fatma to comprehend. She wasn't sure what Aftab was thinking. His gaze darted between her and the door. For a moment it seemed like he might try to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, there was a cold, calculating look in his eyes, as if he was weighing his options. Fatima knew she couldn't afford to wait. She had no idea where Hassan was, or whether he would return, but she couldn't take that chance. If she was going to survive this, she needed to get out. Now. Aftab didn't seem to notice at first, as Fatima made a run for the door. Her legs were shaky, the strength sapped from her body by the physical confrontation, but her mind was clear. As she reached for the door handle, her hand trembling with fear, she heard him move. He was faster than she anticipated, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Before she could even react, Aftab's hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the house with a strength that sent pain coursing through her body. Panic rose in her chest, but Fatima fought through it. She kicked at him, using her elbows to break free, desperate to escape the hellish prison she was trapped in. "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Just let me go. This is over. You don't have to do this." Baft's face twisted in an almost manic way, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think it's over?" he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know what you've done. You don't know what this has cost me." Fatima's heart pounded in her chest. The look in Aftab's eyes was something she'd never seen before, a twisted mix of rage and desperation, fueled by his own failure to control the situation, and in that moment, she realized how far gone he was. Aftab wasn't just angry with her, he was broken. Shattered by the lies, the secrets, and the betrayal, Fatima didn't know what to do next. Her hands, still shaking from the brutal confrontation, reached for anything that could be used to defend herself. Her eyes landed on a heavy glass vase on a nearby table. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it towards Aftab with everything she had. The impact was deafening, and Aftab staggered back, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. It was all Fatima needed. She darted towards the door again, this time without hesitation. She didn't wait for Aftab to recover. She flung open the door, ignoring the gust of icy wind that slammed into her face. The storm outside was even worse than she had imagined, the snow now falling in thick sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. Fatima stumbled into the snow-covered yard, her feet sinking into the deep drifts as she ran. The cold bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the burning fear that gripped her heart. Behind her, she could hear Aftab's footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the house. She didn't dare look back. The snowstorm howled around her, but Fatima kept moving. She had to get to the road. She had to find someone, anyone, who could help her. There was no way she could face Aftab alone. Her mind raced, replaying the violent confrontation over and over in her head. She could still feel the pressure around her throat, the terror of knowing that her life had almost ended in that house. The storm was relentless, but Fatima pushed on, her legs burning from the effort. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and the cold seeped deep into her bones. But she couldn't stop. She had no choice. There was no other way. As she neared the road, her hopes of finding help seemed to dwindle. There was no one out here, no one except Aftab, who could be just moments behind her. She glanced back, and for a brief second thought she saw a figure emerging from the house. But the storm obscured everything, and she couldn't be sure. Fatima reached the road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. She waved frantically, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled toward the approaching vehicle. The car slowed, and the driver rolled down the window. It was a man, his face surprised but concerned, as Fatima collapsed against the side of the car, gasping for breath. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, you have to help me. He's going to kill me." The driver didn't hesitate. He opened the door and helped Fatima into the car, then sped off into the night, leaving the nightmare of the house and the storm behind. But even as they drove away, Fatima couldn't shake the feeling that Aftab was still out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. The car cut through the snowstorm as the man called the authorities. But Fatima could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on her. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. And whatever happened next, she knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The crimes committed that night, the betrayal, the violence, would not go unpunished. The secrets were out, and Fatima would have to face the consequences, no matter how dire. The truth would always find a way to surface, and for better or worse, it had found its way to her. Want more intense and gripping stories like this? Hit subscribe and you'll get access to exclusive content and upcoming giveaways. Don't miss out on the excitement.